We're now approaching the end of June, and here at Transfermarkt, we're undoubtedly in one of the busiest periods of the year. Like the rest of football, we are laser focused on the World Cup as the group stages come to a conclusion. As such, on this week's show, we took the opportunity to highlight 3 key players who've thrust themselves into the limelight with some fantastic performances at the World Cup. We also did a full debrief on poor Turkey, who are already out of the World Cup and became the 9th most valuable nation to ever get knocked out at the group stages of the competition. Alongside all that, we also went back to domestic football to take a look at English football's 2 busiest clubs in the month of June. Liverpool and Tottenham have already spent a huge amount of money on new players, but are they going to fix the problems that dogged both teams last season? All that and much, much more answered on episode 16 of Market Values. But before we get into the big topics on this week's show, we wanted to kick things off with Manu, who has been at the World Cup, who has been a roving reporter around North America. Manu, you've been racking up the air miles, almost as many as Infantino. I don't know if you've seen this, but he's been taking like 3 flights a day. I'm not sure if the Transfermarkt budget can equate to FIFA's, but you're not far off him, are you?
No, I mean, I've been to 3 stadiums so far across this continent at 4 games and more coming. And I've been, I think, in 3 of those games, Infantino was also there, while also being at other stadiums at the same time. If you're tuning in from North America, you be like, yeah, whatever, it's a big place. If you are tuning in from Europe, it's like, how bad can it really be? I stayed within my country, didn't even fly all the way across, Stefan, and it was still a 5-hour flight. And that is considered an almost day trip. So, if you think how bad can it be, that is 3,500 kilometers that we're talking about from the West Coast to Toronto to take in 2 of the games. So yeah, the distances are a little bit different than Europe.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, if Infantino's at all these games, why don't you just share his private jet with him?
I don't think he'd like me.
Yeah. Well, you never know. He might listen to the show. If you're listening, I'm trying to remember his first name was. I forgot it already.
Gianni,
if you're listening, Gianni, let us know in the comments under the YouTube channel or under the YouTube video if you want to let Manu join in. But Manu, we're not here to talk about your travel plans. We're here to talk about 3 players who have surprised us in the last kind of couple of rounds of the tournament. And we picked 3 interesting players. Maybe we start with one of the hosts, the US men's national team. When we're looking to record the show, you mentioned that you've been really impressed with them. But there's maybe one player in particular who stands out amongst a really impressive team performance. I mean, speaking for myself, who has very little kind of experience of watching the US men's team, I've been pleasantly surprised with them in their first 2 games. They go into the final game against Turkey, which is a bit of a dead rubber because Turkey have already been knocked out, which we'll touch on later in the podcast. But yeah, who's the player for the US team that you wanted to highlight today?
It's Folarin Balogun. Folarin Jolaulu Jerry Balogun, born in New York City. Never actually spent any time there. I think mostly grew up in England. But because, his parents were there on holiday and weren't allowed to fly back, he had to be born there. And now the US men's national team is massively benefiting from him. He had a really good season in Liga for Monaco. Scored 13 goals and 5 assists in 30 games there. His market value has exploded this season to 40 million euros, which means he has the same market value than Christian Pulisic, who was the key player for the United States going into this tournament. And Pulisic, as it has been the case for most of his career, has really struggled with injuries and also struggling with injuries at this tournament, missed the second game. But, Mauricio Pochettino's team hasn't really missed a beat because of this guy. He's a very different player, brings very different things to the team. He is a forward, a very dynamic forward with a really good goal scoring record, has already scored twice at this World Cup and provided an assist. He is very capable of playing with Pochettino plays with 2 strikers, and he's one of the reasons why, because he has that kind of explosiveness and directness that a Pulisic has. Of course, he plays it in a different way, but I thought, when Pulisic was out for the second game against Australia, that maybe Australia could cause a few problems here, but because of Balogun being in this team, they didn't miss a beat. And of course, the first game against Paraguay, that 4-1 victory, mightily impressive. What a way to start in the tournament. And you're right, it's a dead rubber. The US has won the group, no matter what happens here. And Turkey are out. So, this is a really good opportunity for them to maybe test a few things and give Pulisic some more time. But I don't know if we really need to focus on Pulisic anymore, Stefan. I think this might actually be Balogun's team now.
Yeah, that's so interesting, isn't it, in the way they kind of frame it like that, because Pulisic has been the kind of poster boy for so long, and I thought it was interesting. I was watching their second game, and Pulisic is sitting there on the sideline on the bench. He looks quite happy because his team are winning, but it's interesting that he's very much taking a backseat role so far this World Cup. You might obviously step in and do a better role, but Balogun's always been a really interesting player. He's always flown under the radar. Obviously didn't quite make it at Arsenal, but has managed to kind of really kind of rebuild his career in France. Finished the season on really impressive numbers actually for Monaco, 13 goals and 5 assists in 30 league games, which is, if you think about it, like how many kind of US players can even in the past have been able to kind of lay claim to those kind of records. So I mean, if you're talking about like raw talent, in terms of like even previous US team players. I mean, they've also had great players in the past, like maybe like Clint Dempsey, for example, and maybe argue like Landon Donovan, although I'd say he was a player who kind of flattered to deceive or didn't really quite live up to his potential, but we can argue about that one if we want. But I think Clint Dempsey is probably the best US men's player I've ever seen play, and I think you could argue that Balogun's already kind of pushing up there in terms of, and I was just looking there. I mean, the current record goal scorers for the US team is both Balogun and Donovan on 57 goals. Sorry, not Balogun. Dempsey and Donovan on 57 goals are both kind of joint record holders. But Balogun's already got 11 goals and 29 caps for the US team. And considering the kind of, which I think, the quality of teams that US play outside of big tournaments, you can see them really racking up that goal tally. So, we might be talking about a player here who's kind of really burst onto the scene for this World Cup, but could go on and break a few records for the US before he wraps up his career, which is nowhere near. He's only 24 years old.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think this could be his tournament. And despite knowing better, teams still look at the World Cup and buy players. A lot of teams have wisened up. I'm actually going to have something on that on the site this week, but a lot of teams have wisened up. But there's still a club here and there out there that sees a player shine at the World Cup and like just has to do it, right? Can't help themselves. But I think if they do it in Balogun's case, it might be really justified, because I think what we're seeing in his case, he's confirming what he's already shown for the club this season, right? And I think that if you're a club and if you're on the fence and you're like, okay, well, we really like his body of work during the season, and then you're seeing it here now under pressure because you, as a host country, you're under enormous pressure, and you're seeing this, you'd be like, okay, maybe I can do it on an even bigger stage.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, another international who's making waves at this World Cup and has actually had quite a fluent history with his nationality in terms of football is Felix Nmecha, who born in Hamburg, moved to England as a young player, Manu, played for England under 16s, then played for Germany under 18s, then played for England under 18s, then played for England under 19s, then switched back to Germany under 21s and is now a fully fledged German international. He's now got 10 caps for Germany. And Manu, as good as England's midfield is, I'm sure they would be watching that game against Ivory Coast and against the Curacao, the first game as well, thinking we might have missed a trick here and let this guy move to Wolfsburg and Dortmund, and then in the preceding time, allow the German FA to kind of convince him to make the move back to Germany, because it feels like Nmecha has just announced himself as such an impressive player for Germany. And in many ways, actually, Germany's best player from these first two games.
Yeah, I think so. I was at both the Germany games, and everyone is talking about Dennis Undav, right? Because he's scoring the goals, and yeah, justifiably so. He is. There's a story there in its own right, but I personally think Felix Nmecha was the best player for Germany in both these games. And the first was against Curacao, although maybe the 7-1 victory is now in a different light, considering Curaçao's draw against Ecuador, right? He was the most dominant player in that match. And against Ivory Coast, he had a little bit of a bumpy start. First few minutes or so, you could see he had to grow into the game, but then he really grew into the game. Defensively top, attacking wise top, creates chances, has scoring opportunities, has a fantastic shot, is one of those players that from outside the box is really dangerous, right? With the ability to just curl the shot home. His pass to, and I watched this now at least 6 or 7 times. The pass that he plays to Unda for the winner against Ivory Coast, it looks so easy. But anyone who's ever played the game knows that this is not easy. But he makes it look so simple. It's so fluid. Yeah, you spoke about how fluid his nationality has been. That pass kind of like encapsulates that. It's just, he gets it and he turns around and then it's like a snap thing. And it's just unbelievable how he understands that Undav A is free, that Undav is not offside. And the goal then, of course, speaks for itself. And yeah, I just think it's been really impressive. I think what he adds to all that technically ability is something that is especially lacking in this Germany team with the other midfielders, is that extreme physicality. They were playing a team that tried to bully them in Ivory Coast, right? And the only reason why that didn't work was Felix Nmecha. And I think, that entire package is so very rare to find in the game today, Stefan.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, I think if you look at what Tony Cruz used to bring to this team, and this is what I always say about Cruz, is that he was obviously such a technically gifted player. There's all these kind of memes about his passing accuracy over the course of his career and how he never misplaced a pass and could hit a shot and things. And he was this kind of metronome in midfield, but he was also a huge unit of a guy. He was a big guy who never got pushed off the ball. And well, I'd say Mecha's probably more kind of industrious than Tony Cruz ever was. He brings that kind of similar presence to it. And alongside Pavlovic, who's by no means a small guy either, and is kind of sprouted into this kind of bit of a Goliath himself. Germany do have this really impressive kind of partnership that, if you think about it, in the past, has maybe been a little different. Like if you compare it to maybe like Andrik and Kimmich, where one's the technical player, one's the kind of hatchet man, if you will, but is obviously getting older. So what didn't really bring that? Or even like Pascal Gross, maybe, who's obviously much smaller as well. So it adds a whole new element to the German national team. And I think going into this tournament, you had, on the one hand, you had kind of older players that Germany were hoping could still do a job, maybe like your Manuel Neuers, for example. And then you had kind of the young stars who were hoping would kind of turn their form back on in the form of Florian Wirtz, Havertz, and Jamal Musiala. I think Felix Nmecha has been a really important kind of surprise package for Germany, in the sense that everyone's just kind of really glad that he's managed to just kind of come out, maybe not come out of nowhere, because anyone who's watched the Bundesliga this season will know he's done very well for Dortmund. But I guess kind of fulfilling that potential, Manu, isn't it? Because at the end of the day, he was the player Dortmund signed to replace Jude Bellingham.
Yeah, and it raised a few eyebrows, didn't it, when they did sign him to replace Jude Bellingham? I think you and I too were thinking, okay, well, that's a long shot. And now I'm looking at it, I'm thinking, how far away is he from being like Jude Bellingham, or potentially even better? There is a world now where that is possible. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but there's a world now where that's possible. We were standing together. I was standing together with a group of German journalists of various outlets in the mixed zone after waiting for Felix Nmecha to speak to us, and we're thinking, someone said 150 million euros. And I was like, that's not crazy, considering how much Man City is currently bidding for Anderson, right? And there is now that world where that exists. And that is mind-blowing, considering where Nmecha was maybe 2 or 3 years ago.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we obviously had Rono from the French team on last week to talk about Boadi, the Moroccan midfielder, and how his market value could skyrocket if he has a good tournament. And I think the exact same can be said of Mecha for sure. He's currently got a market value of 50 million euros at Borussia Dortmund. It's been rising steadily from 20 million when he joined the club. So, in fact, it's risen, it's almost doubled in the last 12 months because of his performances for Dortmund. So, as we know, like these market values do move very, very quickly, especially if there's interest. And I think Mecha, coming from a background in Manchester City as well, a lot of English clubs will know him because they would have watched him at youth level at Manchester City. In fact, I know when I was speaking about him the other day on social media, someone who I know covers Man City's youth teams immediately jumped in and said, I remember this guy playing alongside Cole Palmer and, oh, who was the other player?
Foden.
Yeah, Foden, Phil Foden. They played alongside each other in the youth teams. And, there was always a question as to whether Metric could fulfill his potential like there are two players have. And now he's showing that for Dortmund. So, yeah, I think I wouldn't be surprised if he does very quickly kind of rise up to those kind of fees, the talking points of those kind of transfer fees, Manu, because he's always kind of been in that kind of class of players, just only now showing his potential. But yeah, in terms of players showing potential, another one that I think has kind of announced himself this World Cup, if you will, unless, of course, you're a season ticket holder at Sunderland, and that's Brian Brobbey, the Netherlands centre forward. I watched his performance against Sweden, and I just thought, I feel like this might be a bit discouraging, man, but Brian Broby's always struck me as a kind of football manager player where, he kind of has always been this kind of wonder kid in the making. And then in so many, as is always the case in football manager, these players never quite turn out in real life. It's felt like in the last 12 months, something's just kind of flipped in his head and he's just kind of decided, actually, I'm going to be the player I'm supposed to be. He's had a tremendous season at Sunderland where he picked up 8 goals and assists in the Premier League for obviously a team who are, only just recently promoted. His market value shot up to about 30 million euros. And, we're talking about a player here who I was just checking before we actually started recording. His record for the Dutch national team is really, really impressive, actually. And, for it was under 17, sorry, 16 goals in 24 games, which is when he was obviously very much kind of breaking into the Ajax first team, moved to RB Leipzig, didn't quite work out, and he's now kind of coming to the fore for Sunderland, and now getting his opportunity for the Netherlands, and he seems to be grabbing it with both hands.
Yeah, the 2 goals against Sweden, right? And this is Sweden's side that demolished Tunisia, and Brobbey was a really big reason why Netherlands then demolished Sweden 5-1. Yeah, I thought he was very impressive in that game. I thought the Dutch in particular looked quite good. They really struggled against Japan, where Brobbey only played for 5 minutes, right? And didn't really make a big impact. And then Coman decides to start Brobbey in the second game. And it was just such a big difference to have that physical body up there. Coman has spoken a little bit about the reason why he thinks Brobbey is doing a little bit better now is, he's a big body, physical, very imposing, and has always really struggled with staying fit physically. Like lots of little muscle injuries and groin injuries and all that sort of stuff. And he feels that he's now kind of gone past that. You look at his record for Sunderland. He's starting in a lot more games. Is able to complete games over 90 minutes, even the tail end of the season there. There was only one game where he only managed 61 minutes, and that was the final game of the season against Chelsea, right, where he played 61 minutes. Other than that, I see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 games where he played over 80 minutes, and 4 games where he completed the full 90, right? And Koeman mentioned that is something that's really changed this year, and that has helped him to just be fitter and be more stabilizing his body. And that when you think back about the time that he had at Ajax early on, and then he went to Leipzig, right? And that Leipzig thought they had a good player, but then he quickly wanted to go back to Amsterdam, and they kind of were forced into that. And you could always tell, yeah, he was really good, but then he was on and then he was off. And I think that is the thing that's maybe changing a little bit right now. And for the Netherlands, that's a great thing to have because, he's only still 24. And if he can really stabilize his career going forward, I think we're looking at quite an amazing prospect here. And unfortunately for Sunderland, maybe a player that they're going to have a hard time keeping.
Yeah, I'd say so. But you're absolutely right. I think if you look at who the Netherlands have in attack, they've got a lot of very technical wingers, second strikers, like I'm thinking like Daniel Malen, for example, Cody Gakpo, even maybe, I guess Xavi Simmons, but obviously he's injured, but Somerville as well, they're all kind of more either wide forwards or second strikers. Brobbey's like the one player in that squad who strikes me as a very direct, very clear kind of penalty box striker. And I completely agree with you. I was just watching that Sweden game thinking Sunderland are going to make an absolute fortune off him this summer if he continues to score goals for them. And we all, whether the Netherlands can obviously go and actually win the World Cup's always this kind of perennial, they're always this kind of perennial underdogs or dark horses, if you will, at the World Cups. But they'll obviously still go far to an extent. And if he continues to play, then his market value is just going to shoot through the roof, I'd imagine, because he's already been linked to Bayern Munich, Manu, since World Cup started. Oof. And I suspect more and more clubs will be joining that list in no time at all. But yeah, we'll see how it goes, and we'll obviously check back in on him and as World Cup rumbles on, and check on more players. But I think those three players in particular are ones that have probably stood out so far.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's been fun to watch. There's a few names that here and there, they pop up and you think, oh, he's still around. And it's like, oh, there's actually a really good player. And because it's such an expanded field, we see more and more of them now. So yeah, it's been fun to watch and there's some great stories there.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's go jump into the rest of this week's episodes. We'll take a short break from the World Cup. We'll get back to it. Don't worry, we'll be jump back into it. But for now, we're going to take a short break and head back to the Premier League. While the World Cup is rumbling on and certainly taking up most of our attention, the Premier League is doing its best to drag us back towards domestic football. And two clubs in particular are doing a great job of that, Liverpool and Tottenham, who currently sit first and third for money spent in this coming summer's transfer window. They've already spent between them 160 million euros on new players, and the transfer window's not even opened yet. Obviously, both clubs in need of some big summer rebuilds after disappointing seasons, respectively. Obviously, one perhaps more so than the other, but a lot of moving parts, a lot of interesting things to discuss, and a lot of questions needing answered. So I've asked my good friend Ewan Robertson from the UK team to join me on this week's show to discuss exactly that. And Ewan, I think we could probably get started with Liverpool since they have spent the most money and maybe have the most, up in the air to kind of tie down and fix in terms of transitioning towards a new season after a disappointing spell under Arne Slot. New head coach. They've already spent, as I said, about 103 million euros on two new players. They picked up Jeremy Jacquet from Stade Rennes, who we actually discussed on a recent podcast with Roland Caroff, our French area manager. So you can go back and find that on the YouTube channel or in a previous episode. It won't be hard to find. And of course, Victor Munoz from Osasuna for 40 million euros. But Ewan, maybe what's more interesting is the players that have left. They've lost Ibrahima Konate to Real Madrid. Then, of course, Andy Robertson and Mohamed Salah have both left at the end of their contracts, with Andy Robertson going off to Tottenham and Mohamed Salah's future still up in the air, obviously, while he's still competing at the World Cup. So 3 players left, 2 players joined. I think it's probably safe to say a lot more is going to happen between now and the start of the next season. But what have you made of Liverpool's kind of very early start to the summer transfer period?
Yeah, I think the Munoz deal came as a surprise to everyone, given most people thought he's going to go to Newcastle. Jeremy Jacquet obviously was signed in January, but didn't go through until the end of the season. Yeah, I completely agree. You look at the 3 big players who've contributed a lot to Liverpool's success over years, especially Robertson and Salah, because they've been at the club for longer. And I believe that all 3 need replaced. If you start at Konate, for example, he was their first choice centre back partnership alongside Virgil van Dijk. He's got a lot of experience. He was a great age. He's an elite level centre back. So the issue you've got at Liverpool now is in that position is you have Virgil van Dijk, who's obviously world class, getting towards the end of his career. Then you have 2 young players in Jacquet and Leone, who came in from Parma at the start of last season before having a significant ACL injury, who are 2 young players who are viewed as 2 of the best other age group in the world. So you've kind of got nobody at that sort of mid-age bracket. You've got a Virgil van Dijk at 34, 35. Two youngsters are coming in, no Premier League experience, in their early 20s. So I think they have to go and sign a top centre half who's maybe 25, 26, 27. So there's not too much pressure on those youngsters to go straight in. There's loads of options out there in the market. I really like Lacroix at Crystal Palace just because he's Premier League proven. He's in the France squad at the World Cup. 26 years old. For me, he'd be a fantastic option as well in that area, just given his profile. Left back, Kerkez didn't have the best first season at Liverpool. We'd hope that the fact that he worked under Iola at Bournemouth, that will help him kind of land at Liverpool and relax and become that first choice and really kind of improve his performance levels. And then the big one, of course, is replacing Mohamed Salah, which is, it's impossible to replace what Salah has achieved at Liverpool over his tenure there, but it's definitely not impossible to replace what he contributed last season, because he was miles off it last season. He was clearly coming towards the end of his career at the highest level. Age has definitely caught up with him. So we'll be interested to see what Liverpool do in that position. And obviously, we know who they want.
Yeah, if you go onto Liverpool's rumour page and see who they've been linked with recently, I think it tells an interesting story. You've got Felix Nmecha, who's the central midfielder, Borussia Dortmund and Germany midfielder. Yankuba Minta from Brighton, the right winger. Bradley Barcola from PSG, the left winger. You got Mateus Fernandes Pardo, who is the Lille centre forward. You got Said El Mala, the Cologne in Germany left winger. And then, of course, you got Jan Diomande, the RB Leipzig winger. Now, I'm putting an emphasis on those positions because you've just made a really good point about you go through that squad from last season and the issues that they needed replaced. It's mostly defensive issues, but they've already signed one winger for 40 million euros and they've been linked with a number of other ones. And Jan Diomande is the one that's on the lips of every Liverpool fan this week because some serious reports in England that Liverpool are willing to pay up to 100 million euros for his signature from RB Leipzig. Now, Ewan, when this news broke, I was on social media and I said that Diomande is obviously a very impressive young player, full of potential. Will almost certainly going to be a very good player one day, but I don't know. I think I get the impression, and I think it's also maybe based off the way they swooped in for Victor Munoz after he was so close to signing for Newcastle, linked with Diomande, linked with El Mala, who's on the cusp of joining Brentford, but decided against it. Barcola, who's been more or less up for sale for the best part of 2026. And I made the joke that it feels as though Liverpool's transfer policy doesn't really go beyond the names that are listed on the BBC gossip column every morning. Am I being unfair there, or do you understand the kind of where I'm coming from? Maybe some frustration that Liverpool fans might have that there doesn't seem to be any kind of long-term joint-up thinking here with regards to what they need after last season, but what they seem to be trying to sign this summer.
Yeah, it was certainly the case last summer, wasn't it, when they brought in Hugo Ekitike, who's was it around 90 million euros or a little bit higher, a little bit less than that. Then they go and sign Alexander Isak for a British transfer records, who played in the same position, and that also didn't work out, albeit that was mainly due to the fact that Isak was injured. Going back to your point, they do, in my opinion, need an elite right winger this summer to replace Salah. I think Munoz will play predominantly on the left. You've got options in the left because you've got Cody Gakpo, who can play there. Obviously, question marks over his future. And you've got Rio Angamoa, who's an outstanding young talent. So you don't want to bring in too many players to block his pathway as well, because you want to give him minutes. He was obviously linked with a move to, I think it was Bayern Munich, because he was unhappy with his minutes last season. So Liverpool will be conscious of that. But on the right, as it stands, they don't have an option there at the moment. You could play Jeremy Frimpong there, if push came to shove, but I don't think that's his best position. So you need to bring in an elite player. But yeah, I get your point in terms of when you look at the balance of the squad, it's very front heavy. If you bring in Diomande, then who are you going to play as your front three? Because Ekitike won't really want to play off the left. Obviously, Wirtz has played there as well, which is another kind of problem. It does seem that they've got maybe too many big money, high profile signings in the attacking areas.
Yeah. And then finally, on the topic of Liverpool, we have to discuss the fact they've got a new manager as well in Areola, who obviously joined from Bournemouth. Now, his appointment fascinates me, Ewan, because it felt to me like last season, well, I suppose technically the season before, they bring in Arne Slot. He inherits, let's be honest, the squad that Jurgen Klopp built. He obviously does very, very well to guide them to the Premier League title. And then the following season, things fall apart when Liverpool tried to basically dissect that team and start beginning the transition process of moving away from a team that they'd relied on for so long under Jurgen Klopp. It felt to me at times that Arne Slot was a kind of passenger in that process. He didn't have a huge say in which players came, which players left, and he was just tasked with making the best of what he had. And you can certainly make a strong argument that should be his job in the modern day. Obviously, every club has their sporting directors, their recruitment team, and the head coach is just a head coach. Like the kind of days of Sir Alex Ferguson and Arsene Wenger are long gone, I guess, in that sense, but they used to control every facet of the club. Do you think Areola's been brought in because he can exert more influence, or do you think they just thought this guy's actually proved to be an expert in dealing with turnover of players every season at Bournemouth, and let's hope he can do something similar at Liverpool this season?
Yeah, I think Iraola is definitely more of a head coach than the manager type, and I think Slot probably wanted more control. And even someone like Jurgen Klopp, obviously, he gained more control with his success and his personality, and obviously who he was in the game. I think Iraola is definitely more of a head coach who work a lot on the training ground, a huge emphasis on improving the players that they've got and the kind of tactical approach. And I think he will have also a say in transfers. All head coaches do, but the main work will be done from above him. But there's also a question mark there this summer with Liverpool because Richard Hughes, who's in that position as sporting director at Liverpool, has been heavily linked with a move to Saudi Arabia and Al Hilal. Hughes and Iraola worked together at Bournemouth, so you'd think that'd be a good relationship, a good balance, know how to work together. But if he goes, then that only brings in more problems in terms of like who do we replace him? How's this going to change our transfer strategy? It seems like really peculiar to think that Liverpool were Premier League champions last season, and there's been just so much turnover at the club. They spent 481 million euros last summer. We're looking at a huge outlay again this summer. It just seems there's so much change in such a short period of time in that football club. And was it really required? Like that's my kind of looking at it. Did they need as much surgery as has been done?
Yeah, interesting. It's a very fair question. I guess we won't really know the answer to that until the ball starts to get kicked in the Premier League after the summer, and it'll be certainly interesting to see what Areola can do with whatever squad he does have at that moment in time. But we do have to move on to Tottenham, who were, I think, undoubtedly had a much worse season than Liverpool, even though maybe both sets of fans were relatively disappointed. Also made a managerial change with Roberto De Zerbi coming in before the end of the season, ultimately doing enough to keep them in the Premier League. By the skin of their teeth, it should be added. But like Liverpool, they've made some big signings already. They've already spent 60 million euros on Jan-Paul van Hecke from Brighton, the central defender. Andy Robertson, who we discussed, obviously joined from Liverpool in a free transfer. And they actually picked up, going back to the Bournemouth connection, Marco Senesi from Bournemouth, who's also a central defender. They've only made one departure so far, and that's obviously Yves Bissouma, the defensive midfielder, who departed on a free transfer. Now, we can get into the players they've been linked with because there is a remarkable number of players, and we'll get into that in a moment. But so far, if you're if you're a Tottenham fan, would you be quite happy with the fact that the club have clearly realised after that last season that backline needs completely ripped up and started again, which is evident from the fact they've signed 3 very proven Premier League defenders?
It's been pretty shrewd business so far, in my view, because you've got Robertson, who hugely experienced, great professional, on a free transfer. You've got Senesi, who was brilliant for Bournemouth last season, on a free transfer. And you've got Van Hecke, who, in my book, was one of the best centre backs in the league last season. The price tag on Van Hecke, because he's got a year left in his deal, has also raised some eyebrows. But that's not really how football works. You've seen in recent seasons players go for big fees when they've only got 1 year left in their contract because clubs can sell them elsewhere. I think in the Brian Brobbey last summer, for example. I think their business so far has been really good. It seems that the Tottenham fan base has criticised obviously Daniel Levy's stewardship before he left last summer about the lack of investment, going out and really backing managers. I remember the season where Mitchell Pochettino, I think he got one signing in the summer after getting to the Champions League final. It's obviously caveated by the fact they were moving stadium, and a lot of money's went into that, but Tottenham are a club who have the resources to go out and spend. And I think this is the summer where they will go and do that and look to be ambitious. It seems from the names being linked that they'll back Roberto De Zerbi very strongly in the market. Just look at the interest in Sandro Tonali and Matheus Fernandes, who are linked with clubs who are in Champions League football, like the Manchester United, Arsenal. And so it seems like they want to compete at the top end of the transfer market and go out and get these players. The problem with that is they're not in Europe next season. So, how appealing is Tottenham if a bigger club per se come in?
Yeah, it's worth noting that Van Hecke was actually on our shortlist for Player of the Year in the defender category, so obviously very, very highly regarded here at Transfermarkt, and Tottenham obviously took a note of that, of course, and that's why they've obviously got out and spent the money. On the topic of players who could still come in, and you kind of touched on them, the most obvious links on the Tottenham rumour page are obviously Sandro Tonali from Newcastle, Matheus Fernandes from West Ham, Said Al-Mala again, the FC Cologne left winger, Malik Fofana from Lyon, and Gil Ordonez, who is the Ecuadorian defender, who we touched on actually on last week's episode with our colleagues in South America. They did a really good breakdown on his talents. And then some more attacking players like Savinho from Man City and Ibrahim Matza from Bayer Leverkusen. Of all those names, and it seems as though Sandro Tonali is the one that's really garnering a lot of interest, like a lot of kind of media speculation at this moment in time. I mean, he would be an outstanding signing for Tottenham, I think goes without saying, but maybe raise a few eyebrows the fact that he would swap Newcastle for Tottenham at this moment in time, especially considering he was linked with Manchester United, Barcelona and the likes not that long ago.
I always think it's so easy to kind of underestimate the appeal of London for players to live in. Just it's an incredible place to live, and so many players want to. That's respectfully to Newcastle is also a great city, but for especially for people coming from Italy and overseas, London has a huge appeal. But yeah, again, it would kind of raise my eyebrows. Certainly, he would choose to go to Tottenham, but ultimately, Tonali can only choose to go to a club who bid what Newcastle want for him. And if Tottenham are the only club willing to do that, he's always been linked with Arsenal, but I don't think they'll pay what Newcastle want. So it could come down to it where his options this summer are, staying at Newcastle or going to Tottenham, so he might fancy the change because, let's be honest, teams outside of England, unless it's Bayern Munich or PSG, won't be able to afford Sandro Tonali, so there's no chance of him going back to Italy per se. So it's kind of limited the clubs he can go to, and if Tottenham can offer the financial package, then it could be a real option.
Yeah, it seems as though he's been on the look for a departure from Newcastle for a while now, and as you said, if no one else is going to put an offer in, then Tottenham are quite right to come in and make those offers. Just on the topic of players who might be moved on, Ewan, to potentially finance a Tonali deal and signing from other players, there's a lot of young players in that squad who have been linked with moves. Matheus Tel, for example, has been linked by a lot of clubs, actually. Lille, Frankfurt, Bournemouth. Lucas Bergvall, who you did a piece on Monday, linked with Nottingham Forest, I think Borussia Dortmund, Bayern Munich. You can jump into that in a moment. And there's obviously Luka Vuskovic, who's a really highly rated central defender who's returning from Hamburg. And there's a lot of speculation over his future due to the fact that, Tottenham picked up a new central defender. In fact, they picked up two, of course, in this transfer window. Now, in stark contrast maybe to Areola, and feel free to disagree with me here, I do feel like De Zerbi does tend to put his foot down at clubs when it comes to transfers and players that he wants to sign. Do you think this is Tottenham maybe just clearing house and saying, thanks Bergvall, thanks Tell, you guys have been great, but you're not good enough. We need to move them on. Or do you think this is De Zerbi saying, no, I need ready-made players to do what the fans expect of us next season, and unfortunately that means if we have to cash in guys like Matheus Tell, Bergvall, and perhaps most notably Vuskovic, that's just the price of doing business?
Probably a bit of both. Certainly right, De Zerbi's not shy. He's quite confrontational. He's had fallouts with boards before, so I don't think he'll be. And obviously he took the job at a really weird stage of the season with 6 Premier League games to go. he'd have been made massive promises that he would get back in the summer and he'd have control in the transfer market. So he will have a major say in what's going on. I think he'll be driving everything at the football club. In terms of Vuskovic, you know far more about him than me. He's been a kind of avid watcher of the Bundesliga. To me, it seems really strange that they move him on. He seems like a really good young talent, you know, rave reviews at Hamburg last season. But like you mentioned, they've got so many centre-backs now with the arrival of Senesi and Van Hecke. The expectation will be that Christian Romero will go this summer. They'll also be interested in Mickey van de Veen. So that kind of covers that area, but maybe they think, well, we can make a big profit in Vuskovic and we can, you know, PSR, etc. That helps us go out and sign players. It's probably the same with Bergvall. He didn't start a single game under De Zerbi last season. He was an unused substitute the last 2 games of the season. He's a 20-year-old that came to the club with huge expectation that he could develop into a, you know, world-class midfield player. He'd had trials at Bayern Munich, Manchester United. There was huge excitement when Tottenham acquired him. It was viewed as a major coup. It's not quite worked out for him. I personally believe that he's a immense talent still and could become a leading midfielder, but it looks like he's told Tottenham he wants to go. And with no European football next season, there's going to be less games for him to play. So it makes sense if De Zerbi doesn't fancy him for him to go out. If he could get a move to somewhere like Borussia Dortmund, I think that would be the perfect place for him to develop. You know, they are one of, if not the best clubs in the top 5 leagues for developing young players. You've seen it with players that went from England over there in the past, Jude Bellingham, Jadon Sancho. There's been so many players who have really prospered at Dortmund. The problem with that is I think Tottenham want 52 million euros. Dortmund's record signings, Dembele at 35 million euros, so that's not going to work out. That'd be the perfect place for him to go. And like players like Tell, it'll just come down to whether Zerbi thinks they're good enough. Because they do have quite a lot of young, talented players. So obviously, if you move them on, it's PSR, it's good. So yeah, it'd be interesting. I think they'll do a lot of business this summer. I read something earlier about them wanting to do 8 permanent signings still. So a really busy summer at Tottenham Hotspur.
Yeah, it's also maybe worth adding before we wrap up that they've also had a kind of real changeover in terms of sporting directors, technical directors, and people running the recruitment departments. So while on paper it's great when clubs have these young players, in many cases they could be young players who were rated by the kind of previous regime. And then, you know, when someone else comes in to take over that job, they say, well, let's just try and cash in on them, which might be the case with the likes of Bergvall, for example, or Vuskovic. But yeah, Ewan, it's both going to be really interesting to see how they both do in this summer transfer window, and then, of course, in the Premier League coming up. But put you on the spot before we wrap up here. And I know there's still a lot of business to be done in the summer, but out of the 2 clubs, which one have you been most impressed with so far?
Oh, it's difficult to say because I don't know too much about Munoz. I'll put my hands up and say that. I've watched Jackie quite a lot in League One. I like what Tottenham are doing. Just in terms of picking up 2 Premier League proven players in a free transfer. Van Hecke, excellent at Brighton last season. I think they've had a really good start to the window. I think Liverpool obviously finish ahead of Tottenham in the table next season. I'm interested to see how Iraola gets on at Liverpool because he's never coached in European football before. So he's never had to juggle midweeks to the Premier League. His style of play is so intense. I'll be interested to see how the players cope with that. Also how Liverpool players cope with those demands. But overall, I'll say better start to the summer so far. It's got to be Tottenham.
Yeah, very interesting. But we'll have you back on at the end of the transfer window and see if you've changed your mind on that one. If you're a club, I'm sure you will, of course, exactly. There's a lot of stuff to be happening. That's, of course, why this time of the year is so interesting and so fascinating for so many football fans. And undoubtedly one of the busiest periods for us on Transfermarkt. But for now, Ewan, I'll let you go, and I'm sure we'll have you back on when some more business has been done. So thanks for now, and cheerio. Well, we kicked off this week's episode talking about the players that have impressed us at the World Cup so far. So it seems only fitting that we wrap up this week's show talking about the players that have disappointed us And unfortunately, they almost exclusively come from the one national team. And I'm delighted once again to be joined by my colleague Lara Karacan from the Turkish team. Lara, I wish I could have you back on the show on better circumstances. But of course, today we have to talk about Turkey getting knocked out of the World Cup after just 2 games. First of all, I hope you're well. I hope you're enjoying the summer. But I fear the World Cup may have been a bit of a disappointment on that.
Yeah, unfortunately, yes. Because as you know, Turkey qualified themselves after 24 years. And of course, the buzz, the excitement, everyone was so into it. And now after 2 games, it ended. So yeah, we were very hyped, but unfortunately our journey came to an end much earlier than we expected. But yes.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So obviously defeats to Australia and Paraguay led to Turkey getting knocked out of the competition due to the rules in the group stages, even though they've still got 1 game left to play. Lara, I feel like with the Turkish national team, unlike maybe other teams such as, Australia, maybe a good example, where they don't have any big star players, but maybe work better as a team, Turkey do have some very famous players. We have Arda Güler at Real Madrid. We've got Kenan Yildiz at Juventus. Can Özun, anyone who follows the Bundesliga, a very bright prospect at Eintracht Frankfurt. And of course, Hakan Çalhanoğlu, who's played for a number of big teams in Europe and is obviously a Turkish captain. How do you feel like they performed at this World Cup? Do you think are they the reason that Turkey didn't progress because they didn't perform? Or was there something else was the problem for them at this tournament?
So when we are talking about the star players, of course, they have the highest market values ever for, I think, Can Özun, Kenan Yildiz, and also Arda Güler with his 90 million euros. We haven't got that many star players before, so the expectations were high, and also for them it was very high to perform. I can't say that they didn't perform, but in general we saw that the pressure on them, not only on them, but of course of the star players who would take responsibility in this kind of tournaments, it was too high. The expectations were too high. The pressure from the media, from the people, from the environment, it was too high. So I think they performed okay. They performed what we expected, but not overperformed. And I think when you think back at the Euros, where Arda Güler hits that incredible goal as the youngest goal scorer ever in Euros, of course, the expectation was high that we also see something different, something similar in the World Cup. But as I said before, the pressure was high, and I also had the feeling that this kind of star players like Arda Güler couldn't reach that potential that were expected from him. But I think the performance was not bad, but it was also not good enough. And I think for such kind of tournaments, you need that. Also, you have to keep in mind that Kenan Yildiz was a little bit injured and he was not 100% on his level. And so when these all kind of circumstances come to one thing, and then you have 2 opponents who were very defensive, then you, as Turkey, have a problem to reach that performance that you expected before.
Yeah, absolutely. We did an article on the UK domain, or the English domains rather, looking at the most valuable nations to get knocked out of the group stages. And this Turkish national team are the 9th most valuable nation to get knocked out. Obviously, there's some much bigger nations like Spain, Germany, Italy, etc. But that just goes to show the talent in this squad. So, I mean, people outside of Turkey know how much talent's in this team, and maybe they can apply their own expectations. But what was the expectations and what was the reaction within Turkey from the fans, from the media after they got knocked out of the World Cup?
It was brutal. So after the first match where everything, okay, you can start maybe with a defeat, but the media outlet was like, okay, we are done, we are finished. And also when you have this pressure after the first defeat, the second defeat, when you receive such early goal, then the pressure was so high on the players. And also the media were not really humble with them, not really nice with them, because of course they see you have the such high market values on your star players, on your team. And when we know something from Turkey, then when the expectations are low, then we perform better. When the expectations are high, we have too much pressure on them. And the media outlet was more like, okay, so one simple storytelling to have something for our followers to hear is the players had all a new haircut. So maybe you have seen Barış Alper or Mert Müldür and or Abdülkerim Bardakçı, all of them, or Kenan Yıldız, he also dyed his hair. And after that defeat, the media outlet said, okay, you are only caring about your hairs. Where's the performance? And when you go that in that narrative, then of course the players think, okay, we also were hyped for that tournament. We wanted to have something different. But when the media is also attacking your personal style rather than your play, then of course for the players is that pressure high. And then and before the press conference before the second match, also the player Samet Akaydın said, we have fear to do something wrong because the media is taking everything, and then we have so much pressure on our play to do some failure, to do something. Everything they talk about, the player are reading this. And when you have that kind of pressure in your mind, then of course you can't expect that you play like, I don't know what the expectations are. So the players were also complaining about the media.
Yeah, it's so interesting because it's only Turkey's second World Cup in 58 years, I think, if I'm not mistaken. They obviously did very well in South Korea and Japan and the third place finish. And they've done better, obviously, in the European Championships recently. But it does feel as though the kind of expectations that the Turkish fans put in the national team doesn't quite line up with experience or history or achievements for the national team. And I'm interested in asking whether you think those key players in that team are used to that level of scrutiny or that level of expectation, because obviously guys like Yildiz and Arda Güler play for the biggest nations and biggest clubs in the world, but no one at Real Madrid maybe expects Arda Güler to be the guy who has to answer all the questions. You know, that's Vinicius Junior, that's Kylian Mbappe, Jude Bellingham perhaps. Kenan Yildiz, for example, obviously very good player Juventus, where he's expected to score goals, but I guess grew up in Germany, moved to Italy, maybe doesn't have the same experience of dealing with, you know, that expectation in Turkey perhaps. And Can Ozone, obviously, Eintracht Frankfurt, were obviously the very big club in Germany, but not expected to win every single week. So do you think maybe some of these star players, the environment they have at club level is very, very different from the environment they have for the national team?
Maybe it could be one point, but we also have to keep in mind that these players are very young. So they have so much responsibility in the Turkish national team. And also, I think why the pressure is also high on them, because they showed themselves. As I said before, Arda Güler proved himself that he can take this kind of responsibility in such big tournaments. And of course, when you have proved yourself, then the people expect that you will do it in every tournament. They expect that you are kind of Messi, that you can have this kind of impact on every match because you did that before. And of course, the club environment, we have to also keep in mind that the players are playing in Europe, and in Europe it is different than in Turkey. Of course, in Real Madrid, you have that kind of pressure, like playing for the big clubs in Turkey. But as you said also before, the Arda Güler, yeah, he's a talent, he's a star player. He is also a star player, but the big stars are Mbappe, Bellingham, and so on. So he's not the main guy, and in the Turkish national team, he is. And of course, the pressure is different than at Real Madrid for him.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me ask you about the head coach as well, Vincenzo Montella. Obviously did very well getting to the quarterfinals of the European Championships 2 years ago. But what has been the reaction to his position with the national team following this World Cup campaign? Because he's obviously been at the national team for quite a while now. I think he's now got 35 matches under his belt as the Turkish national team head coach. Have there been calls to sack him? Has he been blamed for this? Is everyone saying this is his fault? We've got the right players, but we don't have the right coach. And I guess also, will he leave the job or will he stay on as the Turkey national team coach?
Yes, in Turkey, when you don't perform or after such big 2 defeats and you are out of the tournament, my expectation was like, I know the Turkish environment is next day, there is an announcement, Montella is sacked. But the president said he don't want to do this. He don't want to have this kind of club logic like we have in the big teams in Turkey. When you have maybe 2-3 defeats in a row, then you are safe sacked. And he said we have this kind of path. We want to go with him. We have this kind of development also over the past years, and we want to continue. And for me, this was a surprise, but I think it's good to have maybe something new also in the Turkish environment, because I think Montella did a great job also in the past 2 years. And now, of course, the 2 games were not like we expected. And also from my side, we could do better also tactical wise. So he has some faults, but when we see the bigger picture, he developed the national team over the past years in a way that nobody did before. Of course, he has some star players that maybe some other coaches hasn't, like Arda Güler, Can Uzun, Kenan Yıldız, of course. But to form a group and have a good mentality on that, and also some group dynamics, there he had really an impact into it. So as it stands, Montella will stay. I think this is a big thing in Turkey because, as I said before, this is not really usual. But we'll see. After that, he has to show himself again that he's the right coach for that position, because I think many more defeats after that tournament, then I think we will go back to the Turkish way of treating coaches, to be honest.
Yeah, it reminds me very much of Scottish football in many ways in that regard. But
Yeah.
I'll maybe try and end on a positive note here, Lara, because obviously we have the Euros in 2028, and which the qualification process hasn't really begun with that. But then following that, 2032, Turkey are obviously co-hosting the tournament. And by that point, many of these players that you mentioned, I mean, Yildiz, Can Uzun, and Arda Güler are all under 21 years old. So in 6 years' time, they'll be in their prime years, presumably. So despite what's happened at this year's World Cup, is there still some hope for you and for Turkish fans that, okay, this was maybe a learning process, but we do have young players, we can get better?
Yes, of course. So of course I was very emotional when we got out from the tournament, but in the next day I am also a realistic one, and I know nobody of them had World Cup experience before. We have such young talents, as you said before, with our star players. So I think this is good that we qualified for this one, and maybe also to have now this negative impact also for the players, that they can feel, okay, this is not enough for such a tournament. We have to push more, we have to give more, we have to handle the pressure outside from the media better. So in my optimistic way, I hope that the people or not only the players, also the staff, the federation learn from it. And I think what makes me very optimistic is when we have an home World Cup, as we seen before in Germany, when we have our fans in our back and the team is pushing in the stadium, then we can beat really everyone. I think this is something special in Turkey, that when we feel the support from our fans, then they play 2, 3, 4 classes better. And so I think, as you said before, when we have these star players, then really in a age where they would perform the best, hopefully, I think this could be a very cool World Cup for us, and also with the players and also maybe with the coach we have. But I think this is the biggest but. We have to learn how to handle pressure, how to handle the pressure in the media, and also maybe to see how we can handle or to have more help, because in this World Cup, as I read, I don't know if it's true, they haven't got a psychologist, and I think in elite football, the players are such under pressure that you have to have such support also in your staff. So maybe in the next tournament, this could be a learning from it, that you need some help, that you need something for the players to handle this pressure, because when you can't handle that pressure in Turkey, then nothing will happen. So the key to success is to handle pressure in Turkey.
Yeah, well, hopefully we'll have you on in 2 years' time when we get to the European Championships, and Turkey will be in a much better position, both physically, talent-wise, but also mentally, the players. And I think, as you said, this tournament should prove to be a wonderful learning experience for those young players. But Lara, thank you so much for coming on the show. Once again, I apologize that it has to come in such difficult circumstances, but I'm sure we'll have you back on in no time to talk about the Superliga and far more exciting and positive stories.